Science of Whales Conference Tee, available in 7 styles, colors, and sizes. The Science of Whales Conference Mug, with conference logo and ACS whale tail logo. ACS tote bag available in 3 colors. Grab yours today at the ACS merch shop on bonfire.com. The American Cetacean Society is excited to introduce Peter Corkeron, Ph.D.'s talk on Where Are We with North Atlantic Right Whales? The past few years have seen the decline of the North Atlantic right whales recognized as a problem and gain a great deal of publicity. In this talk, he will run through how we came to our current understanding of right whale status and their distribution. For example, finding them in the Gulf of St. Lawrence wasn't a happy accident. The ways in which we can improve our understanding of how many right whales there are, and how their rate of survival has changed, and what's happening to stave off their impending extinction. He will also point to where our understanding still needs improvement and what could happen next. Peter Corkeron, Ph.D., now leads the whale research team at the Crofts Marine Mammal Conservation Program of the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life. His current work focuses on the status of North Atlantic right whales, understanding the anthropogenic drivers of their decline and the ecological influences of their movements, and ensuring that the management efforts are informed by the best science available. Peter's PhD was on the ecology of inshore dolphins in the waters off Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. Peter has studied whales, dolphins, dugongs, and seals, with occasional forays into the behavior of fruit bats and wallabies. His research has taken him from the Ross Sea in Antarctica to within 300 miles of the North Pole, and many places in between. He believes in using science to understand how we impact marine wildlife, and then working to solve the problems we create.
Okay, and we're back here. Just make sure that we get Peter on here just momentarily. Let me get my video just a second. There is Peter. I can see you. Let me put it different. I will make sure that Peter is unmuted here. So I'll just ask Peter to unmute yourself if you can.
How's that?
Oh, excellent. Peter, thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to have you. I've just been excited to really have a talk about the North Atlantic right whale, which has been obviously critically endangered. Although I've seen a number of social media posts recently with a little bit of a birth wave on on right whales. Hopefully that there's a better trend to come. So I'm going to step here away. Literally, I'll just kind of mute myself and get a video, and I'll have you share your screen and have you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Uko. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever the time is, wherever you are in the world. Very grateful for the opportunity for this to give this talk, and I'm going to talk about what's happening with North Atlantic right whales at the moment, what we know. So, as this is the American Cetacean Society, when I speak to Americans, because I'm not originally from here and have an accent, I have to point out that this is a Rottweiler and this is a right whale. And I'm talking about the whale, not the dog. A lot of interest 2017 in what's going on with right whales. But we didn't know prior to 2017 that there were problems. But what I want to talk about is how we got to that point of knowing we had these problems. And to do that, I'm going to just go through a little bit about the basics of mark-recapture because we use that to estimate these whales' abundance. So you've got some critters. This is the whole population of some critters. And this Venn diagram of the blue of N1 and this N3, these are animals that are caught on the first capture. N2 are animals caught in the second capture. N3 are animals caught in both captures, which allows us to estimate the entire population. Some pretty basic mark recapture work, but just to get that clear. Okay, so it's originally used to estimate population size, and that's still what it's commonly used for. It's also really good for estimating survival, and annual survival is, how many whales live through from 1 year to the next. So if 100 whales are alive at the start of 2017 and 99 are alive at the start of 2018, then survival is 0.99 or 99%. And working that out's a bit more complicated than when you get past 10 taking your shoes off to keep counting. But anyway, and mortality is obviously the complement of survival. So if survival is 0.99, then mortality is 0.01. So we use mark recapture for North Atlantic right whales by identifying individuals from their natural marks, which for them are these callosities on their heads primarily. And you can see these two whales are different individuals. And here we are. We knew right whales were in trouble before 2017 because we actually know this species really well, and we know most of the individuals of the species. And we had good information suggesting that things were starting to go wrong for right whales, but we weren't quite sure what was going on. So some basics for mark recapture for North Atlantic right whales is that they're identifiable from natural marks, not immediately as a calf, but when they're sort of like less than 12 months old. Almost every individual of the species is known, and the sex of most individuals is known, and we get that from genetics from biopsy. And the ones where the sex isn't known tend to be younger animals because people just haven't got on top of that yet. And for instance, so far this year, there have been 14 calves born, and all of those have been genetically sampled. So we'll know the sex of every single one of them. The birth date to the month for a lot of individuals is known. We have a very long time series of data. The sort of the scientific data goes back to the 1980s, but going back even further, the first record of an individual is from 1935, and she was actually part of the catalogue. She died in 1995, and that was from a newspaper article about some folks off Florida killing a whale calf, and there was a photo of the mother. So we have a long time series of data, and there's really excellent data from about 1990 onwards. So prior to 2017, though, there weren't really good estimates of abundance of North Atlantic right whales from mark recapture data. And there were some technical reasons for that, and some of that was because of what the requirements, the government requirements were for what they needed. And also because the species was so well known, it was felt just, it wasn't something that was needed. But around 2010, things started changing, and so we ended up with a need to actually come up with a mark recapture estimate of abundance for North Atlantic right whales. The other work that's been done is there's been some work on survival that came out about 20 years ago. Some people may remember a Nature paper from 20 years ago pointing out the difference that what saving one female a year could make. But in 2017, Richard Pace and I and Scott Krause published a paper providing a mark recapture estimate of abundance for right whales. And what it showed was that the abundance would increase. I hope you're not seeing these things on here, but I apologise for that. The abundance, this is the overall abundance of the entire species. This is males and this is females. And the species increased until about 2010, and then it declined from then on. We're not exactly sure what happened prior to 1990, but it looks like the species were just increasing prior to then from extremely low abundance. And the peak was a bit less than 500 individuals, in the order of 480 or so. And the other important thing to note is that there are more males than females in the species. For every 5 whales, 3 will be males, 2 will be females. That's because males are surviving better than females are. If we look at the likelihood of actually identifying whales, this is finding the whales in the data. So if you found every single whale, the line would just run across here. And what you can see is that for a long time, we've been identifying more than 4 out of 5 of the whales of every individual in this species. And then around 2010, that changed and it plummeted down in 2012, 13, 14. And it's actually picked up since then. And it's now, for the past 2 or 3 years, it's back up here around 90-something% are being identified. And this is extraordinary data from a wild animal of any sort, to have this large proportion of the species identified every single year. These are the original estimates of survival. This is males, this is females, and this is calves. And the important point here is that this is the original version of this model had survival pretty flat, you can see. It's a bit uncertain. These are measures of uncertainty. But it's pretty flat, and particularly post-2010. I'll come back to that in a bit. What else happened in 2017? Well, we found a lot of right whales dead in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I'll point out that 3 were found dead in 2015 as well. And the other thing that happened is that this paper showing that they'd gone into decline appeared online 2 weeks before the whales started turning up dead. So, and that timing was entirely fortuitous. But finding the whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence wasn't. I used to work at NOAA, and the NOAA aerial survey team had actually gone up there in 2015. They got up in 2014 as well into Canada and flown off the east coast and not found a lot of whales. And in 2015, they went up and flew the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They only got in 4 flights in 2 weeks. We couldn't get up there for very long. The very first flight found something like 35 right whales. And everyone's like, wow, isn't that amazing? And in fact, it wasn't chance. The aerial survey team was very careful in targeting where they went, and they did this very deliberately, and used data, working with collaborators to work out where they should be going. And so anyway, the whales were there. So where do we go with this? You know, one of the things that happened with this work was that we really had to address this problem that people had, that if whales, because it looked like they're in decline, but wasn't it just that they moved? And Pace's model was built specifically to account for that problem. And now we have other mark-recapture models, and also Richard Pace has updated his. One of the things that I did recently was have a look at how other mark-recapture models show these data. And this is the abundance estimate from Richard Pace's model. And this is one using a very, very classical old Jolly-Sieber model. And it always sat a bit lower than Pace's model. And in fact, all the models that I ran did that. And one of the things Richard did, he scratched his head about that, and he was worried about his survival rates that he was seeing. And so he built into his model the likelihood that survival actually changed post-2010. He's done this recently. Now we know there's been this big change. And this is what survivals look like now. You can see and you can see the big decline in 2017. You know, here's these deaths in the Gulf of St. Lawrence showing up in the data. So we're confident that, you know, these models are now tracking the data really well. And so this gives us a revised estimate. You can ignore these top 2 lines. They don't mean very much. And this blue line is Richard's new model. And this one is the minimum number alive. So the number we know with absolute certainty from photo IDs, this number of whales had to have been alive then. And you can see, you know, Pace's model tracks that pretty well and picks up that we do miss a few each year. And so now we're down to around 366 as a point estimate. with an uncertainty of about a dozen or so. So it means there's somewhere between mid 350s to a bit under 380 of these species now. And they're still in decline. So this is not good. And one of the things that we hear a lot about calving, an important point to note about calving is that, how many calves can a female have in her life? Well, right whales should probably live many decades. They should probably live to 100 or so. But most females are now dying between 20 and 30. Some are living longer, maybe to 40, maybe 50. But most are dying reasonably young. If they're maturing at about 10 and 9, have their first calf about 10. And in fact, recent first-time mothers are all much older than 9. And if they only have a 10 or 20-year reproductive lifespan, then the mathematics of that is really clear. If you have you start having babies at 10, have a calf every 3 or 4 years, die at 30, you're going to have half a dozen calves. But if you only have them once every 5 to 7 years, you're only going to have 4 or so. And remember that half of all calves are female, and you need females to keep replacing the population. So that's a real issue. So one of the things that I've tried to do is ask sort of, well, how do we, if we pan back and think about what's the bigger picture of right whales around the world, how do North Atlantic rights fit in? And some of this comes about from me having worked on right whales in Australia. And so we've got populations of southern right whales in Peninsula Valdez here, in Brazil. There's some in some South Atlantic islands, although we're not quite sure what's happening with them and Tristan da Cunha. There's the South African population. There's a southwestern to central southern Australian population, a southeastern Australian population that's very small and not doing particularly well, a New Zealand and Auckland Islands population, and then there's a Chilean population, which is also very small and not doing very well. And so this gives us sort of replicate populations to start making comparisons with. And one of the reasons why I came to this was from working at the head of on the Australian ones back in 1991, at the head of the bight, which is the main calving aggregation for the central and western Australian population, there were 18 calves born, and there were 17 North Atlantic right whale calves born that year. But now at the head of the bight, there's over 100 calves being born, and they've actually filled up the whole head of the bight and moved elsewhere as well. But this year we've had 14 North Atlantic right whales calves being born, and it's seen as cause for celebration because there's 0 in 2018 and there was 4 or 5 in 2017. Why is this so different? And we can expand this and look at calves. The number of calves have been born each year from 1992 through to 2016, and this is from South America, South Africa, Southern Australia, and here's North Atlantic rights. Right? And this we published a couple of years ago. It's a big collaborative project with international colleagues. So now we add some statistics to this. We run a regression line basically through this, and we show that southern right whales from these calf counts, we're increasing it between 5.3 and a bit over 7% a year for these 3 populations. And North Atlantic right whales, that doesn't look like it, that is actually increasing at about 2% a year. And this is significantly different from these 3, and these 3 are all the same. And the other thing is that this line isn't different from 0. So that increase that we saw from 1990 to 2010, by the time we look at this just in terms of calving and put a line through it, the decline that we've had since kind of makes the calf data suggest that numbers haven't changed, which is pretty scary. So what's driving this? And so we can construct a model about how a right whale's life works. And this is a right whale. So a right whale's born, it's a calf. And after its first year of life, it survives and becomes a juvenile. Then it's a juvenile for say 9, 10 years, and it survives through those years, and then she becomes an adult. And an adult survives until she dies. But an adult also has a calf, and this is fecundity, F adult, right? And so we know from the mark-recapture models what the values of these survivals all are. And so we can feed them into this model. And the other thing, we can take this sort of conceptual model and we can turn it into matrix algebra. And I'm sure everyone's delighted to be reminded of matrix algebra from university. But there we go. And so this is the survival as a calf in this matrix. This is the survival as a juvenile, and then this is becoming an adult, and then this is adult survival, and then this is fecundity. And so we have this matrix, and we can just feed values into the matrix and use that matrix to ask questions. And what this is showing down here is what's called an elasticity analysis. And this tells us which of these cells is most important for driving the inherent rate of reproductive, sort of how many whales, how this whale population could increase annually. And the answer to that, when you plug these data in, is that if you take the best survivals that North Atlantic right whales have shown over the time series that we have, they could increase at least 4% a year, right? And what would drive that increase? The most important thing is adult female survival. The next most important thing is juvenile survival. And all these values together add up to 1. So you can see that at 6.25, that means that sort of almost 2/3 of the reason for the rate of increase is inherent in adult survival. So adult survival is really, really, really important. And this isn't a new finding for these whales, but it's important to reiterate. And the other thing we can do is then we can simulate what could have happened. What might have happened if right whales had increased at 4% or so a year. And so this is years from 1990. So here's 2010. And this is the number of females, the point estimate for the number that was alive at 2010. And then these are resamples of hundreds of simulations of that matrix model of how they could have done. And, unsurprisingly, given that when right whales were increasing, they're increasing at a bit over 2% a year. Well, if they could have increased at 4% a year, then there have been almost twice as many females. And that's what this simulation is showing. And an important point about that is that, had there been twice as many females, we'd have more buffer to deal with the problems that we're facing now. So a next step with this comparison is, well, what's driving some of this? And this is a paper led by Frederick Christensen with a whole bunch of us on using drone photogrammetry and Gianna just alluded to this, Frederick's been working with that team as well, to look at the body condition of right whales. And again, a comparison from four populations, this time New Zealand rather than South Africa. We've got Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and North Atlantic. And North Atlantic's the blues, and you can see they're always falling on the low side of all these lines, right? So this is showing how chubby they are for their length. And you can see that North Atlantic right whales are scrawnier than southern rights. And then if we look at this in terms of calving, so North Atlantic right whale mums tend to be a bit smaller than southern rights, which is something we know from the old whaling days. But the other thing is there's this strong relationship between how big a calf is and how big a mum is. And big, fat, chubby mums have big, healthy calves, basically. And what we can see in this one is that North Atlantic right whales' body condition is the mothers are all worse than the southern rights, and their calves are all smaller. And I'll point out, this is for the North Atlantic rights who are well enough to have a calf. Because, one of the things about why we're not seeing calves being born is because many of the females just aren't in good enough condition. So even the best North Atlantic right whales are still nowhere near as good as what most southern rights are. So now I'm going to move to some questions about, what happened with this change? What was going on? And a really cool way of looking at what large whales are doing is through passive acoustics. And there's some excellent work that's been published out of Sophie Van Paris's lab. And I'll just point out that Uko referred to the Women in Cetology Whale Watcher issue, and Sophie's one of the women who's written for that, and she's my wife. So I'm very proud to see that. And it's a terrific issue of Whale Watcher if people haven't read it. And Jen Davis led this work from Sophie's lab and pulled together an enormous set of passive acoustic recordings along the whole coast of the US and Canada. Now, these numbers matter. The smaller the number, the further north you are, right? And so what they did was they blocked out areas of the coast and looked at two periods, 2011 to 2014, and then prior to that, 2004 to 2010. So that was, when there seems to have been this change in behaviour of right whales and when the decline started. And what this messy diagram shows, I'm not going to go into great detail with it, but this is the further north and this is further south, and this is the early period and the later period. And the big thing that comes out is that what right whales did was they left the Scotian shelf and they've moved to a couple of places, one being the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which isn't in these data, but I'll show in just a minute. But the other place is a bit south of, hang on, let's go back up, 7. See here, this area here. So it's a bit south of where I'm living on Cape Cod. So they actually moved here and here. And we can see this change in their occurrence in these acoustics data over this period of time. What about the Gulf of St. Lawrence? There are some other acoustics data that unfortunately weren't available to be part of this big project, but got worked up. And particularly these 3 acoustic recorders here show calls. And so this is the early period. This is the later period. This is just 2 different ways of looking at the same data. Same story though. What happened in the Gulf of St. Lawrence is that there was an increase in right whales use there from after 2014. And so that coincides with, finding 3 whales dead in 2015 and with then finding a lot dead in 2017. They moved into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That's just reminding this is the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So they really have changed their distribution since 2010. And they've moved both north and south in foraging area. And it's not just a simple move to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's not that straightforward a picture. There's actually more work coming out now about which whales are going where, which is turning out to be really interesting as well. One of the problems is we don't have good passive acoustics data yet for places like Iceland, off Greenland, where we can start seeing how greater movements have occurred, but that's going to come. And one of the really cool things about this is it's shown the amazing value of the passive acoustics work and how essential collaboration is for this. And now there are better design monitoring programs for passive acoustics coming online. And so we're going to get a better sense of what not only right whales, but other large baleen whales are doing from that. So now I'm going to move to discussing management, because conservation science, doesn't mean anything unless management can act on the science. And action involves doing stuff on the water that's going to make things better for a whale. It's not just about holding meetings. And I will point out at this point, the Canadian government have really stepped up and started taking action in 2018 and have continued that process. So it hasn't always been successful. 2019 was a bad year in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but it appears that 2020 was a pretty good year in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. A problem was that lack of resources prior to 2017 meant they couldn't do anything in 2015 and 2016. But that after what happened in 2017, things picked up. And, for those who know Canadian politics, what changed was there was a change in the government there back in 2016 or so. And that's made a big difference to, the resourcing to the people involved in doing the work. So to make some very general points about this, one of the problems that we've confronted here in the US is that some of the conservation NGOs have taken the managers to court, arguing they're not doing enough, and judges have tended to rule in the conservation group's favour that basically NOAA hasn't been doing enough to conserve North Atlantic right whales. And that's not just with fisheries issues. There was also problems about seismic exploration, although that's now no longer an issue because that's all changed, and that problem's gone off the East Coast here for now. And what does this mean? I mean, so there's been a couple of court rulings in the past 18 months finding against NOAA, and it's important to note this is a problem that predates the Trump administration. Of course, we now have a new administration in the US, and maybe things are going to change much for the better. But, one of the problems has been that the management has been politicised, that I'm talking about in terms of administration is, in a way, kind of problematic, isn't it? And so now it's about actually getting things done, not just talking about getting things done, but having things happen. And we know what needs to be done. We know that we need to reduce entanglements. Entanglements cause mortality, but they also cause morbidity. They impose an energetic and other cost to whales that particularly we know now reduce females' capacity to calve, for instance. We know we have problems with shipping issues, and we know that whales are still being killed by vessel strike. And noise is still a problem, and we have new industries coming into play that are going to need addressing there as well. But we also need to address the process of management. We need to think about, how can we make all this happen faster and smoother? And how do we make sure that everything's being done the way it should be in a timely manner? And I'll just finish with a couple of thoughts. And one of the things that's happened in the coral reef world, I mean, I know Eric alluded to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and here's a couple of slides, a couple of pictures for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And, one of the things they did there when they rezoned it back in 2004 was they increased protection because the response to knowing climate was changing was that, well, we're not going to know for sure what's going to happen, so we have to build in more buffers. So they increased the amount of no-take areas in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park to increase resilience. Right? And I'll point out that I originally pointed this out 8 years ago now. And, the point of this was that, resilience planning is a form of bet hedging. It's saying we don't know for sure what's going to happen. And so how can we build in the capacity for things to not go wrong that we don't know what they're going to be? So what have we learned that fits into this for North Atlantic right whales in the past 10 years? Well, no one actually projected, that I know of, that right whales would go into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. People did actually project that right whales would go south of the island. There were models suggesting that sort of south of Cape Cod area that I pointed to would get right whales. But no one did anything about that because it was just a model projection. No one knew it was going to come true or not. So I'd argue that what we've learned is that, assuming we know what the future is going to be is not sufficient for management, because we had this huge scramble to catch up once we knew right whales were in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Because one of the problems there was they went somewhere where there was a lot of human impacts, but there was no management for whales in place because the managers weren't expecting it. But everywhere has human impacts, and so we need to account for that. And the other thing is, you know, models are really valuable. Obviously, I've just talked about them a lot, but they're not silver bullets. So I guess where this leads me to is, you know, one thing that I'm getting from the science of this is we don't know what's coming. So we need to build in more buffer. And how can we manage for resilience? And to go back to Frederick's photogrammetry work, you know, how do we get North Atlantic right whales fatter and happier so they're more likely to have calves? And then going back to that model showing that adult female survival is so important, you know, how do we reduce the likelihood that these whales are going to die? Because, you know, a dead female can never have another calf. A skinny female can get fat 5 years later and then start calving again. So with that, I'd like to thank all the people who've made this work possible, because I'm just pulling together a bunch of things. I thank all the members of the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium, which is a huge group of people who've collaborated brilliantly for the past decade. I'll acknowledge the main funders for the New England Aquarium, the Anderson Cabot Centre for Ocean Life, over the many years, NOAA Fisheries, the Island Johnson Volgenau Foundation, Irving Oils. As you've seen, what I've presented has been collaborative work involving a huge number of people. And finally, I'd like to thank ACS for the invitation to be here. And with that, I think I can start.
Perfect. Great. Well, Peter, I'll have you unshare the screen. Sorry for all of that. But we'll make sure to we'll just do that offline. I'll get the your presentation separately. We can do some mending here by way during these sessions recording. So great. Let me see where I'm just going to get a better view here. Oh, there we go. Now I'm looking at some of the questions I know they have. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Peter. This is a talk that's I found it very, it's very important. So let me look at some of the questions I've come in. There we go. Goes in the Q&A. Of course, a lot of questions came up, so I really thank everyone for posing questions. Yeah, a couple of questions that came. A lot of them are similar in the same vein. Obviously, is the question about why the survival rate of females are less. It's just obviously, is that due to pregnancy, birth, calving? I think there's a number of questions, a slew of questions that came into that. Is there something you can have some thoughts on? Or
it's a really good question, and we don't know for sure what the answer is. But females have to make the migration to, sort of Georgia, Florida to have the calves. So they have to run through a gauntlet going down there that males who aren't making that migration don't have to do. And then I think, some of it is that given what they're living through, they've obviously had to find new feeding areas. Mm-hmm. I think being a baleen whale female is a pretty tough gig, and they have to build up condition to get pregnant, and I think it's the demands that are placed on them is probably greater than it is for males, and so that probably feeds into it as well. And then maybe they're just slightly more inshore. Maybe they're just slightly more likely to run into things. We don't know for 100% sure, but presumably the calving migration explains some.
Right. So yeah, it also seems to be a question that was look at other questions. What caused the low survival in 2017 and back in 2012?
Yeah, it's a good question about 2012. Don't know. Although I'm not sure if that was survival or detection for 2012. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was. Yeah, there's what's going on with survival is really interesting. 2017 is definitively finding so many whales dead in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and of the whales that were necropsied, all the deaths there were anthropogenic. Yep. They were either caught in fishing gear or struck by vessels.
Right. The other question is, we've get that a lot too, because we were talking northern right whales, where a few people, certainly people like us who live in the Pacific side. What about the North Pacific right whale? Of course, this talk is about the North Atlantic right whale. Of course, I don't know if you can speak to any of that stuff. Of course, but of course, that is a really beleaguered group. I believe there are only about 30 left or so, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, there's two populations of North Pacific right whales as well, and the eastern population is it's thought to be 30 or so. It's minuscule. Minuscule,
yeah. Someone was saying the population in the Pacific southeast of Chile, Peru is really threatened with no more than 50 individuals. So that's, so we find of these different pockets, I guess, also in the southern hemisphere of right whales that have been not faring well. I'm not sure if there was a question in this one, but any indication why the main issues causing poor condition in females? I think that's something that we addressed earlier on, of course.
And there's more work happening on that.
Right, indeed. Okay, so what do you think about the sporadic sightings of the North Atlantic right whales in 2008 from Iceland? So actually basically into the eastern North Atlantic. So that's, these are not remnant population of the eastern right whale. So I think maybe you wanted to touch on that a bit, or?
Sure. I mean, so far, all the individuals that have been photographed in the eastern North Atlantic have proven to be western North Atlantic right whales that have popped over. But they've all gone to places that we know the eastern North Atlantic right whales tended to hang out in.
Yep.
It's fascinating.
Indeed. Do you think of policy need to be revised to prevent oil and gas exploration? Sorry, my question suddenly that becomes an issue in the future. So maybe you can talk a little bit about oil and gas exploration.
Well, off the Atlantic coast, what happened was there were some seismic permits were allowed, but by the time everything about them got resolved, they'd expired. And that was only a year or so ago, I guess, now that happened, maybe a bit less.
Mm-hmm.
And now the new administration has ruled there'll be no oil development off the east coast of the US anyway.
Right.
There is off eastern Canada, of course.
Yeah. Another question here too, very interesting. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot too, and of course seen some. Is the ropeless trap pot fishing, and what is the viability? Is there anything, an update on that, or is there something you can?
Yeah. Oh well. I mean, it's not my area of expertise.
Right.
Ropeless is being used off eastern Australia, commercially now.
Mm-hmm.
And people are experimenting with it both in Canada and the US now and having some success. How it will roll out remains to be seen. But it's certainly it's an option it looks like whose time will come.
Right. I think there's a couple of questions here too, and of course, I guess it goes back to probably the North Pacific right whale too. But is there communication that you actually have between right whale researchers, not just in the North Atlantic, but obviously from the southern hemisphere, and as well as maybe Russian or Japanese scientists who study right whales or concerned with the conservation of right whales in those specific areas? Is there a I'm just basically trying to take this question a little bit further into, is there a wider cooperation between scientists that study right whales worldwide?
There's not a worldwide right whale consortium yet.
Right. Okay.
There certainly is a Southern Ocean Research Partnership program on southern right whales that includes most of the people working on southern right whales. And then I can't speak to the Pacific. I mean, I have no idea.
No. Another question here too: is there evidence of toxins from the mainland running and being a factor possibly for female reproductive or maturity rate here, as well as survival? So basically, just looking at runoff from toxin runoff from land.
Yeah, it's a possibility. There's some evidence that there are some pollutants that you'd wish were at lower levels than they are. How big a problem it is, we don't know.
It's certainly not in relationship to their reproductive abilities or, okay.
Well, it's hard to parse out, you know, how much each factor is responsible for the problems.
Okay. We're just going to couple of questions. See, we still have a little bit more time, actually, in spite of the little issues that we had in the beginning. So, are there protection measures to go OSL from the 2020 season going to be enforced longer term? Can measures in changing fisheries gear be brought about quickly enough to adequately help reducing entanglements? Yeah, that's just, it's the alternative fishing gear. Yeah, right.
That's the big question. You know, somehow we have to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. To what degree do you work with? Because obviously fishermen are stakeholders, and I'm thinking back of the book from Tora Johnson about the intertwined fates of fishermen and whales. And to what degree is cooperation with fishermen and the fishing community? How is that dynamic? How is that relationship? Can you speak to that?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I mean, there are certainly fishers who many scientists in the right whale research community work with, and there's some very strong collaborations with some folks, and there's excellent collaborative work going on, trialing, for instance, ropeless gear in a variety of groups now. So I'd prefer to focus on the optimistic view of it, that, you know, there are certainly some folks in the fishing community who are really keen to see the entanglement problem resolved, and are working very well with scientists to try and achieve that.
Very well. Very good. That's good to hear. Just maybe a last question here. So what is the leading hypothesis behind the shift in habitat use in the North Atlantic right whale population? Why are they moving?
That's a good question. Yeah, so the Gulf of Maine, which is where they were, is like a bathtub that's being filled with hot water. And basically, and you know, their prey is just being washed out of there, and it's just not there anymore. Or to know any of the extent that it was. And so they're having to go elsewhere to find it.
Indeed.
You know, it's actually, that process is reasonably well described now.
Yeah. Let me see if we can squeeze in one more. Is there possible correlation in the Northern Hemisphere worldwide with a reduction of food sources as we're seeing skinny gray whales? Yeah, they're obviously trying to make a comparison to the gray whale issues that we have here too. We see emaciated gray whales. It's something I'm not sure if you can speak to any issues that are relatable to what is that parallel? Is that sort of what's happening with right whales as well? I'm not sure if there's a similarity. I'm not sure if you can speak to that, Peter. But
well, I think a big difference is that, you know, grey whales are at relatively high abundance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, you know, North Atlantic rights just aren't.
Right.
There are some similarities between what's happening in South Africa with right whales and grey whales in terms of maybe they're hitting carrying capacity. But North Atlantic rights, the problems end up looking the same but come from somewhere different.
Okay. Well, with that, Peter, I'm going to be closing this section off. This is phenomenal. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your you coming on here and joining us and giving your time for this. I'll check in with you later too about the obtaining your presentation, so we can fix that in a future video. So, Peter, I will have you have you off the screen, and thank you so much again. And
thank you very much. I just want to say, and I'm sorry if that was a bit of a mess, but our families are still getting over COVID. So,
oh my goodness. Okay, no,
had it through the household. So,
all my best, and also to Sophie. So, absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good.